Good afternoon, everyone. And we're still having folks continue to join, but as they continue to join, I just want to welcome everyone to this third segment of this series of RAND webinars, broadly focused on advancing data policy and prevention for SMVF, that's service members, veterans, and their families. I'll introduce our featured presenters in just a moment, but before we get to that, I just want to share a few things. I'm Don Harris, Senior Project Associate with SAMHSA's SMVF TA Center. I'll be serving as the moderator for this webinar and future webinars as well within this series. Just a little bit of background about SAMHSA for folks who may not be familiar. SAMHSA leads public health and service delivery efforts that relate to mental illness, substance use, and addiction on behalf of the United States Department of Health and Human Services, and provides treatment and recovery supports or supports to foster recovery, while ensuring access and better outcomes for all. Since 2008, SAMHSA has partnered with states and territories via SAMHSA's SMVF TA Center to provide technical assistance to those localities. You can use the QR code above that you see at the top of the screen to gain more information, but broadly, just providing an overview of some of the objectives of the SMVF TA Center. We do serve to monitor evolving trends that exist across this population and across behavioral health related topics that relate to this population. We provide technical assistance in a number of different forms, such as policy academies, implementation academies, webinars such as this, and generally serve as a platform to connect states, counties, territories with one another in order to share best practices and promising practices with one another. We also serve to connect those states, counties, and territories with subject matter experts who can provide support in all of the initiatives and efforts that they put in place. Here's some of the methods that I just described. In addition to the ones that I talked about, we also provide assistance with resource and toolkit, dissemination and development, learning communities, and technical assistance calls. If you're not familiar, there's likely an effort within your state, county, or territory that relates to supporting service members of veterans and their families. Now, our presenters across this entire webinar series do hail from RAND. For those who aren't familiar, RAND Corporation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization that helps to improve policy and decision making. They've been in this field for many, many years, providing some of the guidance and research that supports a lot of the initiatives that have taken place that support veterans and service members across those years as well. As I said before, this is a 6-part webinar series. For those who may not be registered for the entire series, feel free to use this QR code. I'll leave it up for another few seconds. If you'd like to be informed about future webinar segments that are taking place each month of the year, or over the next couple of months, I should say. Largely, again, this entire series focuses broadly on data, policy, and prevention for this population. Today, we're focused more broadly on, I should say, kind of that critical period in the lives of service members and veterans, namely the transition from military to civilian life. And while this transition can create opportunities for growth and reintegration, it can also create challenges for those same folks. So our presenters who we have here today, Dr. Laura Werber and Dr. Whitney Livingston, will help shed a little light on this by speaking to some of the research that exists in this space. Just a brief introduction. Dr. Werber is a senior management scientist and professor at the Rand School of Public Policy, and her work focuses on organizational and policy issues related to military families, reintegration, and workforce systems. and she's led important research examining how organizations foster veteran social connectedness. Dr. Livingston is our second presenter on this webinar. She is an associate behavioral scientist and a licensed clinical psychologist at RAND, and her research focuses on suicide prevention, military to civilian transition, women's health, interpersonal violence, and behavioral health among service members and veterans. And Dr. Livingston has also provided clinical care and support in the Veterans Health Administration as well. So at this point, I'll be turning it over first to Dr. Werber, but I'd like to say for the folks that are in the audience, I want to direct your attention to a couple of different ways that you can ask questions or share thoughts. First and foremost, there is a Q&A function that you'll notice in your toolbar. Feel free to drop questions there. We'll try to address them as we can throughout, but we will have a segment of time specifically allocated for questions and answers toward the end of this webinar. During that time, we'll have the opportunity to open up microphones should folks want to verbally share their questions or their thoughts with the presenters. All right, so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Werber, and you should have control of the slides.
Great. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for setting aside time to be part of this discussion today. Oh, I definitely have control as I skip ahead. So as Don mentioned, I'm focusing on some work we completed a few years ago about what veteran serving organizations are doing to strengthen veterans' social connections. Okay. No. Our work was motivated by compelling evidence that social connections have many benefits for everyone, and for veterans in particular. For veterans, some of the benefits of social connections include less severe PTSD and increased help-seeking behaviors. And conversely, a lack of connectedness is associated with adverse health outcomes like suicidal thoughts and behaviors. In spite of this evidence, there's been limited research to date on understanding efforts to promote social connectedness for veterans and how those efforts are evaluated. That gap and our desire to help both veterans and the organizations that serve them motivated our study. The report that I'll be discussing today is listed on the slide. I believe they're also dropping a link into the chat, and I'll also post the study information again at the end of the presentation along with the QR code if you'd like to review it. Our findings are based on a national survey of veteran-serving nonprofits and interviews with a subset of survey respondents. This slide walks through our survey process. Our goal was to reach as many veteran-serving nonprofits as possible, which is a bit tricky since there are not only thousands of them, but also there is no single comprehensive directory of those organizations. So we used a multifaceted approach that included reviewing the National Resource Directory and the VA's VSO Director for candidate organizations. We also tapped into the Veteran Policy Research Institute that's a part of RAND to that network through targeted mailings and social media postings. And finally, we reached out to veteran collaboratives to request that they share an invitation to complete our survey. Through this mix of approaches, we were able to reach out to over 350 organizations. We fielded the survey from January through May of 2022 with the survey window left open longer than planned to accommodate multiple rounds of recruiting. Our survey included questions at the organizational level as well as at the program level in case organizations had multiple programs that served veterans. Organizational questions included questions about the organization's age, their mission, and the location, as well as indicators of capacity like budget, staff size, and experience with program evaluation. And questions at the program level included ones about areas of veterans' wellness that those programs addressed and what the format of the program was like. In total, 107 organizations responded, including 27 who only partially completed the survey. We kept 7 of the partial incompletes, which resulted in a sample of 87 organizations. And of those 87, 5 skipped the program-specific questions. So for the program level analysis that we did, we had responses from 82 organizations. And finally, at the end of the survey, we asked participants if they were willing to participate in a follow-up interview, and the majority of them said yes. Oops, double tap. Ultimately, we interviewed 14 organizations from the ones that took the survey. And together, those 15 interviews, they were a range of sizes with annual budgets ranging from $250,000 a year to over $5 million. They had a variety of geographic locations and different kinds of programs that supported veterans. The interviews were intended to delve more deeply into topics that we covered in the survey, including what the programs intended to promote social connectedness actually looked like, how or why they helped the veterans in this way, and how successful the efforts have been. We also discussed program evaluation, why it matters, how the organization has evaluated its programs, if at all, and what was perceived as helping or hindering the organization's efforts to evaluate social connectedness in their programs in particular. Moving on to our findings, the 87 organizations that we surveyed offered 292 programs intended to promote different aspects of veteran wellness. The organizations had been serving veterans for 21 years on average. 39% of them support veterans nationwide. The rest operate in a limited number of states, most notably in California and in Texas. Finally, most of the organizations in our survey sample were small. 71% of them had only one physical location, and 44% of them had an annual budget of $250,000 or less. Since we do not know how big the overall population of veteran serving organizations is, or what the population looks like, we couldn't determine how representative our respondents are of veterans supporting organizations more generally. We know our sample is definitely tilted more towards smaller organizations. So it's possible that some of our findings might not apply to larger organizations with budgets well in excess of $5 million a year, for example, which may come up later. We can discuss that. Since our survey was targeted to organizations that support veteran social connectedness, we were surprised at the wide range of veteran wellness domains these organizations indicate they support, at times in conjunction with fostering camaraderie and social connections. The survey included a list of 12 wellness domains shown here, and the slide shows how the 292 programs are distributed across those different health and wellness domains. Not surprisingly, camaraderie and social connections tops the list, but what's also notable is that more than half of the programs support veterans' mental health and education. Fewer programs in our survey were intended to provide direct help meeting material needs such as shelter, food security, and financial and legal stability. Overall, it appears that many organizations are providing other supports to veterans in addition to, or perhaps in conjunction with, supporting them with social connections. Looking more closely at the camaraderie and social connections domain of veteran health and wellness, we wanted to understand, how do programs actually go about promoting veteran social connections? Using a combination of the organization's names, their missions, and their responses to an open-ended survey question about how their program's activities help veterans in this way, we developed a typology that fits most of the programs identified in our survey as promoting social connections. This slide shows the results of our efforts. 14 types of programs intended to promote social connectedness. These are listed in alphabetic order. Most of these should be self-explanatory, but I'll highlight a few of them to help differentiate them. Group therapy includes activities that involve group discussions guided by a mental health professional. Peer mentoring, peer support includes activities in which veterans provide formal peer-based support to other veterans. Sporting events passive includes activities that involve passive enjoyment of sporting events, such as attending a baseball game. And there are also two related to visual and performing arts. Active includes activities in which the veterans learn about or engage in a visual or performing art, such as painting, drawing, or stand-up comedy, while passive is a passive recreation, such as veterans attending a movie or going to a concert together. This typology was intentionally expansive, focusing less on how prevalent the programs were in our sample and more on what might be part of the larger set of veteran serving programs. This slide shows how prevalent the various types of social connectedness programs were in our survey sample. One type of program, physical and outdoor recreation, was especially popular in our sample. It's also worth noting that sometimes the programs overlapped. For example, a week-long retreat focused on trail running, or getting together for food and drink after some volunteer work. But they did not do so in a consistent way, so we left them distinct for now, pending other research. We also learned through these very programs how they facilitate social connectedness. Our interview suggested that the programs do so in 3 distinct ways. The first way, which was mentioned in the majority of interviews, was providing a setting in which veterans can experience camaraderie and a sense of belonging. The quote shown here, which is from an outdoor recreation program that trained and supported veterans through a months-long backpacking trip, illustrates this approach. The second mechanism of action we identified was serving as a catalyst of social connectedness by linking veterans with programs that provided the context, including people for socializing and building connections. The quote here is from an organization that described its intermediary role in steering veterans toward opportunities that renew their sense of purpose and belonging. Some of the organizations that are studied did not specifically aim to directly connect veterans with other people or organizations. Instead, their purpose was to restore veterans' capacity to connect. Programs of this nature were structured to provide veterans with one-on-one interactions that would prepare them to build social connections. Other programs, such as the one described on the quote shown here, had veterans working with animals. Working with animals, in our sample with animals like horses or wolves, was described as a prerequisite or a stepping stone to successfully and meaningfully interacting with people. At the start of my presentation, I mentioned that our study aimed to understand both how organizations promote social connectedness for veterans and how they evaluate such efforts. So the next part of my presentation covers the findings from the survey and interviews about how organizations think about evaluating their programs. Specifically, what do they see as the value of program evaluation? Why do they do it? What types of program evaluation have they used? And what barriers to program evaluation have they encountered? We are interested in starting with the why because the reasons might influence their choice of evaluation approach, and that could inform the development of evaluation tools and other support for these organizations. Through our interviews, we learned about 5 different reasons for conducting program evaluation. One of the most widely cited reasons was that it helps to identify program improvement opportunities. The slide here shows quotes from our interviews about this evaluation benefit. Another popular reason for conducting program evaluation was that it enabled the organizations to validate the program, to prove what it was doing actually works. The third reason for carrying out program evaluation was to demonstrate value to donors. As the comment in the bubble to the left shows, some organizations rely heavily on the donor community, so this reason especially resonates to them. Program evaluation was also seen as a way of demonstrating value to another group of external stakeholders, namely future participants. Programs with evidence of impact were perceived as more attractive to veterans and or to those who refer veterans to programs. The last reason was a lofty goal, to demonstrate the value of this kind of program for the community and for society more broadly. This was especially notable to us in light of the Surgeon General's 2023 advisory about the loneliness epidemic facing the United States. Turning our attention to whether and how the organizations evaluate their programs, Almost all of the 76 organizations that offer programs to promote veteran social connections reported some type of effort to gauge their program's success. Note that to avoid an overly long survey, this was one of the questions we asked at the organization level, not the program level. Looking at how these organizations evaluate their programs, as shown in this graphic, by far the leading type of evaluation was a pre- and post-program type of evaluation, in which data were collected from participants before and after their involvement. What's also interesting is that in spite of most organizations stating that they have a way of evaluating success, some respondents didn't seem to know what that method was, or perhaps did not consider it a formal program evaluation. Our last set of findings relates to barriers to program evaluation that organizations cited during their interviews. We've grouped the barriers into the three categories shown here: data collection challenges, resource constraints, and measuring outcomes. With respect to data collection challenges, we heard concerns about surveys that were perceived as onerous and long by veterans and staff. And we also heard that collecting data from veterans was intrusive, possibly so intrusive that it deterred veterans from sticking with the program. We also heard about small sample sizes, sometimes due to low response rates, but also because some programs only serve a small number of veterans. This makes it hard to detect statistically significant evaluation results. Barriers related to resource constraints include limited funding as well as staffing concerns. Organizations talked about costs not only for staff, but also for fee-based tracking and outcome management systems. Some interviewees also mentioned being short-staffed and lacking the bandwidth to carry out the types of evaluations that some funders require as a condition of their support. Sometimes graduate students and other types of volunteer support were helpful, but that was not an enduring capability. We noted that staffing-related constraints also affected outcome measurement. Some interviewees shared that their lack of program evaluation experience and having the importance of someone and recognize the importance of having someone with that expertise to complement their staff's talents. As one interviewee shared with us, you don't find a drywaller to build a car. Program evaluation is like taking on a whole other thing. Finally, interviewees shared that it was difficult to measure social connectedness in concepts such as the true health of veterans. And it was also difficult to measure successful efforts to prevent isolation or to prevent other social-related problems. It's important to note that some of the barriers that I've noted may have emerged in interviews because, as I noted earlier, some of these organizations are small. Larger organizations may not encounter some of these barriers or may have developed strategies for overcoming them. The results of our study also suggest some ways to improve support for veterans serving organizations. And in this final section, I highlight key takeaways from our study, along with both recommendations for practice and for research. Considering first the implications our study has for practice, the VA, DOW, and philanthropic organizations can all help organizations that seek to support veteran social connections. First, at the time of the study, there was no single national directory or census to track the programs intended to foster social connections camaraderie, and social connectedness was not represented as a category in the veteran resource databases that we reviewed. Accordingly, we recommend helping veterans to find these resources by ensuring resource directories include social connections or social benefits as a focus or area of support. Adding details about social connectedness programs, where they are, and what activities they offer to these existing directories is one way to get the word out, and this may be a way to amplify organizations' own outreach efforts. You may remember earlier that I also mentioned that organizations reported helping with multiple aspects of veteran wellness, such as physical health and mental health. So we realized that some programs may be helping to promote social connections, even though they were not explicitly intended to do so. And other programs might be able to help with this aspect of veteran wellness with minor modifications. So with that in mind, we suggest that the VA, DOW, and donors could help organizations to do more with their current programming, but also support social connectedness. For example, a workforce development program that uses a cohort model may be promoting social connections without measuring that outcome, Or a program focused on mental health might be able to incorporate strategies intended to help improve veterans' capacity to connect with others. Finally, as I mentioned a little while ago, resource constraints related to funding and staff capabilities were a barrier to program evaluation. Targeted investments in program evaluation could help to reduce these barriers. This could include direct funding, but it's not necessarily limited to that. Convening a conference or other ways to share evaluation best practices and lessons learned is another way, as is supporting the development of program evaluation related guidance and tools. Finally, there are ways that research can facilitate evaluation of social connectedness programs. First, there is a very large body of research on social connectedness and related concepts such as belonging, loneliness, and isolation that could be mobilized and utilized to help improve veteran social connections and programs, as well as the efforts to evaluate them. However, findings from this research base have not been systematically extended to veteran serving organizations. It would be a big lift for these organizations to distill the key lessons from literature themselves, but there are definitely insights there for the taking. For example, extending social connections research to veterans could help with both the design of these programs and their evaluation. For example, the literature shows that there are ways to gauge the strength of bonds that are formed as a result of program participation. We also found that organizations struggle with assessing the full impact of their programs, including measuring social connections and relating them to veterans' overall health. We think that researchers could identify promising strategies to measure the impact of social connectedness and how it relates to veteran health and wellness overall. As I just mentioned, some organizations offer programs that help with multiple aspects of veteran wellness. Those organizations can benefit from support in developing a holistic evaluation strategy that gives them the big picture of all the ways that their programs support veterans. And finally, in light of the barriers to program evaluation that I've discussed, step-by-step guidance and tools would likely help many organizations to improve their program evaluation efforts. While this could especially be the case for smaller organizations with limited funding and staff, interviewees from larger organizations also told us they would appreciate this kind of help as well. Sometimes large organizations had strong program evaluation efforts in place for outcomes such as reduced PTSD symptoms, but they struggled with how to assess improved social connectedness. So thanks for your time and attention. This concludes my presentation. Here's the QR code I mentioned for the full report. Welcome your questions, and thank you for your interest in this. I'd also just note too a fun fact about the photo on the report. It's actually a picture that I took. I was for many years involved with a veteran serving nonprofit that did a lot to focus on improving veterans' health, largely through social connections. So I had an opportunity to see a lot of this work, this impact in action as a private citizen and a volunteer, in addition to my work as a researcher. So thanks again for your time and your attention and your support of veterans.
And thank you, Dr. Werber. So, I like the fact that this really validates a lot of what we hear and what we have come to know about kind of transitioning from military service to veteran, being in that veteran space back in the civilian world. That oftentimes one of the strains is that we lose that bond, that camaraderie, that tribe that you're with when you're in military service. So identifying key ways to make that connection within your respective neighborhoods, communities, etc., seems like from the data that you just displayed is key. So I like that typology that you showed, the 14 different types. That's really interesting and kind of a good guideline for places to look, whether you're at a state level, county level, community level, an organization, nonprofit, on areas that you could look into to help build that bridge as folks transition. So thank you for that. And now at this point, I'm going to transition over to Dr. Livingston to talk a little bit more about that transition itself. And as was just posted in the chat, feel free to use that Q&A pod. Once again, if you have questions or thoughts about any of the data, the research, the topics that are being discussed here. And they could be addressed throughout, but we'll have a space toward the end as well for that information to be addressed. So what I'll do at this point, I'm going to turn over slide control to you, Dr. Livingston.
I got it. Thank you so much. That was a great talk, and great way to kind of lead into thinking about broadly transition, and part of that will certainly be social connection in those communities that can be altered throughout. So I'll hop in there, and I wanted to just highlight, so this is myself. I am an associate behavioral scientist, licensed clinical psychologist. I had been trained through the VA and certainly been on both research and clinical side at VA, and then came to RAN, and I've been really kind of delving into a lot of research with suicide prevention, interpersonal violence, and military to civilian transition. Here I've got the access to the full report. As you'll notice as I'm going through, I'm going to actually be referencing 4 different reports. This 4th one summarizes some of those key topics in the first 3, while also delving into the recommendations that I'll discuss today. So we'll go through this piece, but just to start us off. So this work was conducted through and funded by Rand Epstein Family Veterans Policy Research Institute. It's this funding that RAND has received and funds VPRI, which covers a number of different veteran issues and topics. I certainly encourage people to check out their website. There's a number of great resources. So, for instance, they publish Issues in Focus, which is here are like the 3-minute reads on everything you need to know on women veterans or community care or suicide prevention for veterans. There's great resources there and great information on kind of that high level. Here's what I need to know in a quick touch. There's also great research that's published through VPRI, larger studies as well. And certainly what I'm going to be covering today is an example of much of the work that they've done. So in today's talk, I'm going to be starting off just giving a high-level military to civilian transition, what that looks like and what some of the challenges are. I'll then move to some of the methods that I'll be discussing and how we went about these roundtable discussions that I'll be talking about today. I'll then talk about the recommendations that were voted on and discussed in the last roundtable. Then think a little bit for what are those next steps, and then have time for discussion and questions. So starting with that first one, there we go. So military to civilian transition, 150,000 service members are separating annually. And if you think about maybe one time where you changed jobs or you moved locations, for these individuals, it's tenfold that, because they not only are leaving their job, they're now having to change housing. Maybe they have children in school systems. They're having to find a new school system, new healthcare provider. Maybe they have family members who are employed and they also need to find a new job. And so it's kind of a world of a change in terms of the amount of challenges and changes that these individuals are having to go through, as well as their families. And I think that there's been more and more attention to this issue, and long term we've certainly thought about kind of what are these challenges, but trying to really improve what that support looks like. There is a lot of existing support already, so both federal and nonprofit organizations are involved in military to civilian transition. Take federal support, for instance, $13 billion is spent on employment and education support for service members leaving the military. This, of course, includes GI Bill, TAP, but it doesn't include all of the programs. So that's 45 programs that are at least focused on employment and education support during transition. There's also programs that are focused on providing support to service members with mental health challenges or other challenges that they might be facing as they come out of the military. On the other side, we've got nonprofits. So nonprofits, oftentimes we think of them as kind of filling in those gaps. They can really provide targeted, individualized, here's who we're trying to support and the particular type of support that we're trying to provide. They may also have more generalized. But what we tend to see is that these can be a bit more siloed. It's not that we have kind of an overarching structure. We've got federal and nonprofit organizations, and each are doing different types and lots of great work, but we see that they can be a bit isolated. And so we can imagine someone coming out of the military is facing a lot of change and a lot of challenges, and now trying to navigate the system of figuring out where the best support for them and where to find them. And that brings us to kind of challenges that persist years after separation. So for some, we'll see that, the challenges that they face is really in that acute period right after transition out of the military. Whereas for some, it may come years later. Maybe they got a job that worked good enough for when they first came out, but it really wasn't a career, something they could kind of grow and build in. And so what we see is that there's not just this period, just 1 year and then everything's figured out. It can be a really kind of challenging process for some. For others, they might have a smooth transition and have the support that they need, or they've taken certain steps to ensure pieces are in place. So not to overemphasize that, everyone has a terrible transition. There's certainly a great majority that do have a smooth transition, but we're, of course, concerned about those that are facing more challenges. All right, so moving on to what we actually did here. So as I mentioned, there's a number of federal nonprofit organizations that are in this space trying to provide support. And we've got these different perspectives. And how do we kind of bring multiple heads to the table, in this case, quite literally, and start to understand what are those challenges and how do we get closer to improving and finding solutions. And this is where VPRI really wanted to conduct 4 roundtables, and I'll get into those a bit more, but to really understand, bring different perspectives together and have space to discuss, here are the challenges, and here might be some ways that we might be able to improve that support. So again, holding 4 roundtables between 2022 to 2025. One thing I'll note here is kind of right before or right after this report came out was around the time where the verbiage of Department of Defense changed to Department of War. I stuck with Department of Defense here simply because we had stakeholders using that verbiage, and I just wanted to stay consistent with the report, but just to note that that change had occurred close after this one was published. So 4 roundtable reports, 12 to 15 stakeholders across the roundtables, and we had a great range between Department of Defense, VA, nonprofit organizations. We also heard from veterans and family members of those who served, so really getting kind of those personal perspectives as well of people who've actually had that lived experience going through. Also included researchers who have expertise in this area, as well as journalists that have great perspectives after covering these challenges over the years. So really trying to bring multiple heads to the table. All right. So the first 3 roundtables really focused on different stages of military to civilian transition. So that first one, focusing on prior to separation, what are those challenges? Think like year before separation, as they're maybe starting to get the wheels turning on, maybe I'm going to separate or not. There also might be some that have, for instance, a medical separation where this is completely unexpected. So really talking through 3 hours of talking through, here are the different things that service members might be facing as they're thinking about or kind of met unexpectedly with separating. Roundtable number 2 then is thinking about during separation. So what does it actually look like when you're going through that process of separation? You're closing out everything on the DoD side and then moving to civilian life and veteran side. So thinking through kind of what does that look like, not only for the service members, but also for their families and other supports, their jobs, housing, all those components. We then move to roundtable number 3. So this is thinking following separation, both within that year after separation and thinking more long-term. What does it look like 3 to 4 years down the road? And what challenges might be showing up in the acute period versus the long-term? That brought us to roundtable number 4. So here, what we did after the first three is we sat down and we thought, okay, here are all the challenges that our stakeholders and experts are bringing up, and what might be some recommendations based on those discussions. Like, what are they bringing up that are challenges that we might be able to improve transition support? And so VPRI, then we created a list of 17 different recommendations, and we then had participants that were attending the fourth roundtable vote on those recommendations. So we wanted to see what is the degree to which you agree or disagree that this is a recommendation that we should carry forward with, or that should be carried forward with. So all the roundtable experts vote on that, and then came to another 3-hour roundtable where we then hashed out, okay, here's how everyone voted. We had this many agree or disagree. Like, what do you all say? Love to hear from the people who are disagreeing or agreeing, and trying to get a better understanding that way. So there was a range of topics that came up, and these recommendations could fall into different buckets. It's not just these four, but in this presentation, I wanted to kind of highlight 4 key areas that did kind of emerge as topics that came up, challenges, as well as recommendations. So for the first is individualized support, thinking about that not every service member is on the same path and might need individualized support. The second is federal transition support. So what are some thoughts on how we could improve that support? Second is third is nonprofit transition support. And then that last one is support for families during transition. So thinking outside of just that service member, what are the other individuals who might need support during that period? So let's talk about it. So as a reminder, I'm going to run through these. The first slide of each of the 4 is going to be, here are some of the topics that were brought up across the first 3 or 4 reports. And then I'm in the next slide going to break it down into what are those recommendations that came up. I'm not going to be able to go through every recommendation, as I mentioned, as there's 17, but we'll get through 8 of them. So just to start off, different veterans, different transition paths. So a successful transition can look different for every veteran. This came up in multiple roundtables. So thinking through, experts mentioned how different factors can impact veteran needs and how willing they are to seek that care. So for instance, someone who's junior enlisted versus maybe has been in the military for 20 years and is retiring, they might have a very different experience coming out of the military and have different needs for what supports they may require or be supported by. Along with that, health conditions. So if someone has maybe experienced more trauma or gone through certain experiences in the military, they might be coming out with health conditions, and that might change the supports that they need. Maybe they need VA medical support a lot quicker. And experiences prior to and during military service. So also thinking about that service members can come into the military with different experiences, and that might also change kind of how they leave the military and what supports they have after they leave. This is one quote from one of our roundtable experts. So junior enlisted were the ones coming for help last and taking advantage of the fewest services. So just to kind of highlight their perspective on that they were seeing a difference in kind of who was asking for help and when they were coming for that help. And sometimes if they're coming later, then it can be harder to really get them the support that they need versus if they're coming sooner. And so we start to see some differences there. So the first recommendation I'm going to discuss, so the recommendation was targeted, tailored services to individuals more likely to experience challenging transitions. So this is one of the more discussed topics across the roundtables. In the voting, 8 agreed with this and 4 disagreed with this, and led to some interesting conversation. So one of the pieces is kind of thinking through do you provide support to the largest number of service members or veterans, or do you target those tailored services to those who might have more challenges or have more needs during separation? Some of the discussion came for against this recommendation were that nonprofits are already targeting those with greater challenges, and even so, they oftentimes will get more than they have capacity for. And so the concern was, like, if you really target tailored services to certain individuals, it can kind of nonprofits are doing that, but also, like, they might not have the ability to continue doing that if they're getting too many that need that tailored support. Also mentioning that, like, that tailored support can take a lot of people effort on the side of the nonprofits, and so sometimes they don't have enough funding or staffing to be able to kind of hold that up. Another point that was against is that if you focus on too much on certain veterans that have maybe certain flags in their data or in their medical records, or maybe they're showing certain signs, that others might be missed. This was a point at which one Roundtable expert raised a personal story of a loved one who had on paper looked fine, didn't look like they needed a lot of support, and then afterward went on to experience some pretty severe mental health challenges after transition. And so the concern there is, if you really just focus on ones that we've, just on these factors that have been identified before, that you might miss people that are really struggling afterward. So this was one that had more contention, which was interesting to kind of see the different sides and the different considerations. It's a tough one to answer. And the next one, so increase outreach to underserved veteran communities, including those in rural U.S. territories and tribal lands. Nearly everyone agreed. We had a 12-to-1 here. And some of the points that they brought up were that rural veterans face more challenges accessing support, getting that transportation. They also mentioned how Native American veterans, particularly those on reservations, can have a lot more barriers to receiving the care that they need, as well as culturally competent care. And so there was a lot of support that, more attention was needed towards these underserved veteran communities. And part of this recommendation as well was that nonprofits should carry this out and think about kind of how they are able to, serve the population that they currently are, but also make sure that underserved veteran communities are receiving outreach as well. So then we'll move to kind of that broader topic on federal transition support. And a lot of the discussion brought up many benefits as well as shortcomings of federal transition support. So experts discussed that some of the benefits are certainly the numerous support programs, that there are just so many transition support programs aiming to help service members through this process. And another point was that because of this, a lot of the support, or there is a lot of support that begins before separation. So take, for instance, transition assistance program, really starting in the year before. Service members are going through a required curriculum to really gain some understanding on certain aspects like finding a job and CV, things like that. And so part of this was that, the federal supports are reaching service members or at least have that option for support earlier on. Some of the shortcomings are that there have been some federal programs that are falling short of their targets. There's been some GAO reports that have come out in recent years on that, even though all service members are required to receive a certain curriculum, what they're finding is not that not all are receiving that curriculum. And another point was that a shortcoming is that there's so many agencies involved that no one agency is really taking responsibility for delivering adequate support. It's kind of like tragedy of the commons. There's too many people, kind of too many agencies involved where there's no one that's kind of holding up that responsibility. So one of the recommendations that came with some of these discussions is the idea of, and again, this is a recommendation that was put together based on the prior roundtables, and we posed this to them so that they could vote and discuss. The recommendation was VA should be the lead agency primarily responsible for veteran transitions. I've shortened these some for the purpose of the slides, but the full recommendation included coordinating with DoD, Department of Labor, Department of Education, Small Business Administration, and other federal and state agencies as necessary. So here again, we saw more contention in terms of 8 agreed, 4 disagreed with this. For those that were for this recommendation, they mentioned DoD is not incentivized to help separation, whereas VA is. Certainly DoD wants to hold on to their people and to keep them if they are willing and able to continue in the military. So there's not really that incentivization to keep them to have them separate, whereas VA is really there to support in many ways, and so it could make more sense for them to kind of be the lead agency. Another benefit is that more service members might apply for benefits through VA if that was kind of a central hub for transition. Views against it were that TAP needs to begin before separation, so Department of Defense, Department of War really should be the lead. There was another expert who mentioned this piece. The reality is that the organization that the individual is transitioning from holds the most power over that individual. And so just thinking about how support is actually implemented, that really Department of War needs to be involved. Another against was VA's mission is not transition. It would be a really heavy lift for VA to take that on and could result in getting support too late. So they're concerned if support is starting after transition, for many that might already be too late and not preventative enough. There were also some neutral views. So the issue, one expert brought up, the issue is less about which agency is responsible and more about agencies improving coordination. And another mentioned that too much responsibility is really placed on these governmental agencies, and perhaps, and really in particular DoD and VA, and that maybe there are other agencies that should be more involved, as well as service members being very involved in kind of their support and seeking out that support as they go through. That second recommendation, so all federal programs that support transition should be independently evaluated to assess their impact on transition outcomes and identify opportunities for continuous improvement. The full recommendation includes evaluation should use a common set of outcome measures, results publicly available, should be publicly available, evaluation should be sufficiently powered for subpopulations. And so here all agreed. There was a lot of agreement around wanting these independent evaluations of federal programs. They mentioned that evals could identify where service members slip through the cracks, understanding, are they receiving the outreach? Are they receiving the support that was sought after? What was the aim of that program? And then others mentioned that results could have important implications for federal spending, allocation of resources, and support for veterans navigating transition out of the military. All right. So now we move to nonprofits. Again, oftentimes it was talked about that nonprofits are really filling veteran separation support gaps, and that they really play this critical role in kind of filling in areas where maybe federal programs aren't able to provide that individualized support, or maybe aren't reaching veterans once they're kind of out in the community and civilian life. However, some of what was noted was that nonprofit organizations oftentimes will face funding uncertainty. We heard different examples of the strategies that nonprofits will do just to be able to pay the bills. Things like, renting out part of their building, or trying to find these kind of workarounds to have enough funding to continue to turn on the lights. So That was a big concern. Another was that nonprofit organizations must make difficult decisions on allocating support. This feeds into one of the first recommendations that I talked about. But because there's these limited resources, they have to think about how are they going to go about reaching the veterans that they're hoping to support. They also brought up that veterans experience challenges with getting connected with the best nonprofit to meet their needs. And so this feeds into how, support really needs to be individualized, and yet it can be really difficult for veterans to figure out like what nonprofit would actually be able to provide the need that I support for the need that I have. Limited evidence on program effectiveness was another piece that came up, that there really isn't much evaluation that's been done on whether nonprofits are actually meeting their goals or delivering the care that they say they are. And so that was brought up as kind of a concern, and the way that that lack of evaluation can then make it difficult for nonprofits when it comes to funding. So this brought us to a couple different recommendations. This first one is highlighted for VA, but was with the idea of nonprofit support being involved. So this one is that VA should develop a central website that transition support programs can opt into if they meet certain standards. So if they were to, for instance, have an evaluation or collect some data and just see whether they're actually reaching the veterans they hope to, for instance. All agreed with this one. There was big support for this. They did mention that service members and veterans often don't know where to find proper support. They give examples of veterans who will have to go from nonprofit to nonprofit trying to figure out like who will be able to give them the support that they are seeking. And the other piece is that that can also delay when they're getting the support. That, of course, takes time and energy when veterans are really going through this time of upheaval already. Another piece was that federal and nonprofit support operate separately. So this might be a way to kind of have one-stop shop, one place for veterans to go and be able to find out, here are the different options nationally, locally, and here's some information on kind of how it's been going. Whether they're providing the support that they're saying they are. And finally, that it was noted that it was useful to require certain standards for nonprofits to even have their program listed on there. There was concern that kind of it would just be inundated with all these programs that maybe don't directly provide support or don't meet certain standards, and so then we would potentially be offering that to veterans. They go to that and find that it's not helpful or it's detrimental, and so it was discussed that there need to be certain standards to make sure that that doesn't happen. The next one is that researchers evaluating nonprofit transition support programs should be encouraged to ensure evaluations include a broad range of transition outcomes to reflect the diversity of transition experiences and post-service goals. Nearly all agreed, so 12-1. The one disagreed, someone mentioned who's directing the researchers. The concern there was just to make sure that stakeholders are involved in that process, that researchers aren't kind of working in this silo. And a lot of the agreement for this kind of came through a similar vein in terms of evals need to consider that nonprofits, the power of kind of those results and how much that could really affect a nonprofit. So one of the examples was that there might be some nonprofits that provide general care or general support, and then there might be others that provide support, for instance, for veterans who are unhoused, and how those outcomes might look really different. Maybe for one, it's finding them a shelter, and for the one that is delivering more broad care, maybe it's finding that person a great career. And if we were to just use evaluations and not understand the nuance between the different types of support that are provided, it could be really kind of detrimental for these nonprofits. So this one is really kind of bringing into perspective that piece. And I'll bring up that quote. So if the evaluation puts a nonprofit in a box, it can limit the potential for positive outcomes. Really warning that, these outcomes matter, and they can oftentimes be tied to whether that nonprofit continues to receive funding. This is our fourth and final one, kind of key bucket that showed up. So families require military separation support as well. What came across in the roundtables is how much family members are also going through transition. So they are experiencing, certainly they need to find new jobs, new places to live, new school systems, new communities. That social support might not look the same. But I think one example that was really, I think, kind of brought it out is one expert talked about how oftentimes the spouse might have to take on a job that's not in their career field in order to move closer, in order to move with the service member. So maybe they're in a base in a very rural or different area than where their expertise or their work is performed. And so they might have to take a job that's not at all in their career field. And then 6 years go by and they kind of come back into civilian life, and now they need to find a job that's back in their career. And that can be really challenging because they don't have the same supports, they don't have the same connections. And so just to point out that these spouses, loved ones, families are really going through a lot of change as well. This was something that was loud and clear across the roundtables. And so that's where we then saw a number of recommendations that came across, these two in particular, which had all agreement across the board for both of these. So the first was that DoD should identify and implement additional ways to incorporate family members into the transition process. A point that was brought up is that, it's not uncommon that loved ones, they'll go through all these changes. They also might, for instance, take on a new role like a caregiver. And so they really need to be looped in on kind of what that service member is going through. How do they find the care or get them connected, get veterans connected to VA care as quickly as possible. And so really they highlighted that incorporating family improves support for service members, was the view that way. An example of a way that this could be further improved was, for instance, maybe families receive a point of contact as the service member is transitioning out of the military, and so that they have someone that they might be able to connect with to receive that same information or ask questions. Another one was DoD and VA should develop a transition support geared toward family members that incorporates information for things like employment, housing, and healthcare, really these social determinants following separation. So they called out, service members have TAP, or they have these different programs through DoD and VA, but what do families have? And so here really kind of seeing a lot of support for increasing that support that might also just be geared towards the experience that spouses, loved ones, family members are going through. One last piece I wanted to highlight here is that the note that there are certain factors that might change what family member we're talking about. So if we're talking about a junior enlisted versus someone who's retiring after 20 years, what that support for family members looks like might be different, and what those needs are might be different. And so once again, we see not only are there individual paths for service members as they separate, but their family members and who's involved in supporting that service member in their own transition can differ. All right. So going forward, just thinking through, certainly I know we've put, we'll put the links in the chat. You'll see those 17 recommendations, and they're really meant to get some really thoughtful discussion around those, but also how can we kind of improve transition support from the federal angle, the nonprofit, the research, these different angles and these different kind of stakeholders that are all involved in providing this support. And so certainly today we highlighted some of those, but if you want to kind of read more, the report highlights each of those and kind of those main points that came up throughout those discussions. I'll highlight here, these are just the 4 reports. So conditions of post-service success, that's our first one. If everyone is responsible, then no one is, it's the second. This is a solvable problem, really talking about transition support after separation, that's our third one. And then this fourth one, again, wrapping up kind of overview of the three in terms of here are the top topics and having those stakeholders vote and discuss those recommendations. I just wanted to take a quick moment. This is some other RAN work that I've been working on, and we recently published. This is work funded to Drs. Jordan Davis and Eric Peterson. It's a R1 long-term study, but the first part was conducting 50 interviews with veterans. And one of the really interesting pieces of this, this was just published, I guess 2 months ago. And it was interesting to kind of go through the veteran interviews. We were asking about transition support and experiences as they were coming out of the military, and to see some things reflected from these recommendations from the veteran perspective of kind of what it was like to find healthcare, or challenges with, cost of living going up since they had been in the military, and having challenges moving back towards, where their family was when they first joined. Those are just some examples, but I just wanted to take a quick moment to highlight that this is a recent pub that kind of shows that veteran side. I'll rent it out there. That's my contact information. If anyone has more questions after, always happy to chat. And as well, I put that veterans.ran.org website there. Certainly worth checking out Veterans Policy Research Institute for some of those resources as well. Thank you so much for joining. I appreciate it.
All righty. Thank you, Dr. Livingston. Very insightful information. Also good to hear. And I like the way these two presentations really do build upon one another in terms of, what Dr. Werber described was like some of the ways that we can support social connection, and then kind of transitioning into what you were describing, especially that the family transitions to. And I think that is something, you described it well, it's often overlooked, but thinking about that typology of social connection, right? The family kind of forms a tribe when they're in military service too. You could have spouses, you could have children who kind of all connect on some level playing field. And then what does that look like when they're coming out of service as well? What are the ways that they can connect? And they're probably very similar to what Dr. Werber described in her presentation. So thank you for that information. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A pod, and they may be specific to, or at least one. I think one comment builds on another question, but Dr. Livingston, it may be specific to your presentation. So if you wouldn't mind taking a look at those, or that one. At this point, we do want to transition to any questions that folks may have and want to pose to either of the presenters. What we can do, feel free to use that raise hand function that you have, and from there we can have your mic opened and you can feel free to just ask their question. Otherwise, you can still feel free to use that Q&A pod while a person is engaging with the presenters as well. And I guess I could have, at this point, suggested that either of you could have answered the same question live, as well as it relates to VA and veteran specific peer specialists. So any thoughts or questions from folks who are visiting us, viewing this webinar in regards to the first presentation related to social connectedness, or the second presentation mainly focused on transitions and some of the research there? And while people are thinking, I do have a question that kind of it came up as I was listening to you speak, and either of you can answer this question, but there was a comment about, you mentioned it, kind of this tragedy of the commons issue that we could face, where it's kind of who has the ball, right? Whose responsibility is it? And you touched on it in a couple of different areas. Because we're not only talking about sharing responsibility. You mentioned DoD and VA, who should be the lead agency, but you're also talking about state level transitioning. You're talking about a person who truly transitions back to a community, not necessarily to the state itself, but they're in some neighborhood. They visit, they go to this church and they go to this supermarket and they go to this barber. So they're in a specific community. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on what are some ways that communities can use the information that you shared, right, at a very local level, to help support some of these efforts. Where I know there's some high level activity taking place in terms of what's happening at DoD, DOW, and at VA, and in addition to some other agencies like the Department of Labor also helping to support. But as we come down to the community level where a person lives and that that neighborhood, that zip code level, what are some ways that they can use this type of information to help support those transitioning veterans?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm sure Dr. Werber also has input because social connection would be such an important piece of that. I'll just start off to say that on the local community space, I think one of the main issues is just like veterans not knowing where to get that support. And so whatever local communities can do to kind of, here's like a one sheet place on some resources. Maybe they already know about VA resources, but here's some local ones. Here's, by us, we have Team River Runner. Like, here's a veterans social connection group that you can join, or some resources that way. So I think, one, it's like bringing all our resources to one place so that veterans aren't having to do that research and that search while they're going through one of the biggest changes of their life. But also then having the social outreach to really reach those veterans. One of the things that I found through my research is that there are organizations that are supporting veterans will tell us they are receiving support from this organization that is not a transition support organization. Take like a career center at a university. And so another aspect is, if you're out in the community and you might be kind of interacting with veterans. For instance, maybe you have a center that's providing support for housing or different things like that. It's asking that question about, hey, have you ever served in the military, or when did you separate, to kind of get an idea of where these individuals might be at, because you never know when someone's kind of walking through the door and they are having this recent experience that could really shuffle things in their life. And the organization might not even know that kind of they're interacting with them. If they do, then they might be able to provide kind of, okay, here's some other supports that you might be needing, or that might be helpful. So those are two kind of areas I think about it.
So yeah, I 100% advocating for asking the question about military service far and wide, because if we don't know who we're engaging with, whether or not they've served, it's hard to route them to those resources that are available for veterans, or folks who served in general. And I guess my question, I kind of teed it up a little bit, Dr. Werber, but related to family members. Is there anything that in your research and kind of what you talked about in your presentation in regards to social connectedness that came up related to specific for family members, maybe either spouses or military children transitioning back to the civilian world, that kind of falls within that typology, or kind of emerged out of that, the discussions or surveys that you had for veterans? And go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, please finish.
No, I was just going to ask, I know that it's oftentimes, and we hear this a lot, that it's usually centered on veterans, the services, the folks who've served, but especially when we're talking about in the vein of suicide prevention and kind of who is I don't know how to put it, kind of the first line of defense to support that veteran. It's going to be the family who's living with that person, who recognizes changes in behavior more quickly than the broader community. The question is, what's there to support those folks as they transition as well in general? I don't know if that came up at all.
Thinking about the study that I focused on today, the organizations that took the survey, I feel like they were focused on veterans, but some of the things they did could include the whole family. Like to go to the baseball game together or to do the hiking together. Like the programs were not only limited to veterans. Sometimes their decisions about are they open to the spouse and or the children. So that varied, but it wasn't necessarily targeted on supporting dependents. The other thing I think about was the idea about restoring veterans' capacity to connect. Sometimes it was they weren't even reconnecting with their spouses and their children. So it's like their social connections, even with the people arguably most important in their lives, were broken. So it's like they're supporting the spouses and the children, but in a veteran focused way versus focused on bringing them in intentionally. But that's not to say there aren't other organizations that do have that more holistic approach. And another thing I thought about, and it was actually something I was looking up in response to one of the comments in the Q&A room, some work I did many moons ago on the reintegration of guardsmen, and reservists who they were actually my first exposure to veterans were people who were being deactivated and going back in the civilian community and their unique challenges. That work focused more on the families, like the whole family experience. So that was when they would have, and I think they still do it, like beyond the yellow ribbon events and things like that. So there's definitely resources that are focused on the families or were, especially when we were in a very deployment heavy environment. But some of the work coming out of that earlier work I did was that sometimes the families, this is less about supporting them and their support for veterans. Sometimes the spouses in particular are the conduits for veterans to get help. Like we looked at the whole web of support and the informal networks of your family and friends into getting veterans supported was like a really big finding. So that, spouses in particular, and this even is related to some RAND work on the caregivers, is they're like the conduit to get veterans the care they need. So this is a roundabout answer to your question, but just thinking about how my research has touched on spouses and children, that would be the main ways versus in my work that the focus on programs just for them. But hopefully that's helpful.
Oh, thank you for that. Yeah, I 100% agree with that sentiment that sometimes and oftentimes the family members, could be the spouses, could be the children, are the ones kind of nudging that veteran to get to the right care, doing the reading, the research to say, oh, did you know this was available? In many different cases. Looks like we have a question. I'll just read this aloud from Jay. And it says, was the qualitative data collected from individuals who meet the traditional federal definition of veteran? Did it include individuals with varying discharge characteristics or those from the National Guard?
I think that's for me. I don't know if, yeah, okay. Just want to make sure. Yeah, so there wasn't it wasn't like only VA enrolled veterans. This was certainly spanning all veterans, kind of those who left the military, and particularly because we were thinking of, nonprofits might be reaching some of those veterans who might not be able to VA enroll, but are might be seeking support as well. So not using a kind of VA enrollment or a certain kind of federal definition of that, more so just focusing on those who had left the military and separated.
Thank you for that. Looks like Jennifer's sharing information. Okay.
I would just add, I'm looking at Jennifer's comments, that it's interesting about what the VA can or can't do. I know this is more from my volunteer experience than my research experience, but there's a lot of issues about you want to refer or recommend organizations, but the VA can't endorse them formally. And it's just sometimes that tension of, we know certain organizations that are out there, especially more grassroots ones or local ones that can help, especially in rural communities. But then it's like I said, there's ground rules about endorsing them. And I know when I was a volunteer, a big achievement for my organization was getting an MOU with the VA so that specialists could refer veterans to our organization, and then we could take that warm handshake and work with it. But just there's some interesting barriers. There's a huge web of support out there. I mean, that's what made it hard for us to find organizations for our survey. But I think VA employees sometimes have a challenge of how they're allowed to actively steer veterans into certain organizations. Over.
And you bring up a great point, Laura. It's and I have to ask, Laura, did you mention what branch were you in?
I am not a veteran.
Oh, I thought you were.
I just been around a lot of them over the years. But
Okay.
thank you for thinking that compliment.
So often, and this is kind of piggybacking on what you said and Jennifer's comment, that the resources themselves often get so they can be so overwhelming that it almost has the reverse effect. And I know you brought this up a couple of times, but the VA kind of can be restricted from endorsing certain organizations out in the community. But we know many of them are plentiful. Even though they may have small budgets, they are there to help, but there can be so many of them that it's hard to know which one to go to. So oftentimes that prevents those veterans from accessing the right services within the community as well. All right, so I'll ask just for final thoughts from either of you that kind of emerged from this research. Anything that you feel may be something that's on the cusp, that emerging from the research that you talked about here today, kind of some next steps beyond, or anything you would recommend. I know you provided recommendations, but anything you want to highlight specific to your specific research lane or the research you discussed today. I'll start with you, Dr. Werber, and then transition to you, Dr. Livingston.
I think what comes to mind immediately to foot stomp is this: there's a lot of serendipity of programs intended to help in one way, being able to help in others. My focus was on social connectedness. I know my work on supporting veterans, there's a lot of talk about the octopus of needs. And it's just that programs intended for one thing really can help with others. I just think so. It's just, especially in a funding constrained environment, it's like you can sometimes do more in a single program. And I don't mean that to dilute the modality of certain ones, but for me it was like an interesting surprise to find out, like, oh yeah, like if we have a group together, even if it's focused on volunteering or mental health or like I said, education or employment, you can achieve this other benefit. It's just a matter of like really understanding how to best design and evaluate that. So just like, yeah, I think that's like more especially relevant now, just in an era of shrinking resources for some of it. The other thing I would just mention is, even though my work is a little older, these issues are enduring. And I know a lot of times with reintegration work over the years, a lot of the work I've been involved in and seen, it focuses on a very critical period of 90 days or 6 months out. But a lot of issues have a very long tail, and the problems don't come up for like a year or two later. And social connectedness is kind of an under the radar thing. And the dating organizations are supporting veterans. We got to get you a job, and we want to reconnect you with your kids, and very important immediate needs, and financial needs are critical. But some of these things have a slow burn. And so I just think, as people focus on supporting veterans, one is this idea of, programs that tackle multiple aspects of wellness. But don't forget, like if someone's been out for 2 years, or especially now, we're not in a deployment heavy environment, these things are still issues, and the public eye is turned from them, but they're still there. So I just would leave you with that.
Thank you. Anything to highlight, Dr. Livingston?
Yeah, those are great points. I just want to definitely start off by saying thank you all so much for joining, and all of the different questions. It's wonderful to hear different thoughts and all the ways that you already are making great change for veterans. I think I'd cover kind of two pieces. If I put my clinician hat on, I'm really thinking about kind of just this family piece and how much they will kind of slide under the radar. But these are really big changes for family members and children to go through. And so however we can kind of amplify that and get them the support that they need, so that eases transition, not only for themselves, but I think then internally, or it actually will help the service member or veteran as well. On the research side, I think one of the big pieces is just realizing how little we really know on whether these programs are doing what they aim to. And it comes at it from an angle of like, how can we improve these? How can we make them just a little bit better so that they are meeting the needs of service members and veterans? And I'm thinking both federally and nonprofit. It's really challenging the nonprofit side to, get the funding or even just have space or time to be able to collect data. And I think that, what can be also harmful is if a veteran is going to an organization and they're not really delivering on that piece, that that can be really discouraging and challenging, I think, for individuals. And I think they deserve to kind of know that the programs that they're going to are reaching some of those aims that they set out to do. So I think my dream world would be that we'd be able to do more evaluation and understanding of kind of what's actually going on, and are they reaching those goals, and maybe they are, and then we have kind of a good answer on making sure that veterans are receiving the care that they deserve. So thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Excellent. Great point. So I'd like to thank you both for taking the time to join us. And for the folks who have joined us online for this webinar, and hopefully for the remainder of the rest of the webinar series. If you haven't, this is the QR code to scan if you'd like to register. I think we have 3 more left in the series. I'm sorry, this is to register for topics in the news. The registration for the QR code was early on, but if you connect with the SMVF TA Center, you can be connected to this webinar series. So feel free, this will keep you in the loop by connecting with our topics in the news overall. So once again, want to thank everyone here for taking the time to join us. We will have send out information about our next webinar, which will occur in roughly another month or so. So thank you once again, Dr. Werber, Dr. Livingston, for taking the time, and everyone else have a great afternoon. Take care.